So shall we? Is Helen here? No, Helen. We'll do number 11, the residual disinfection chlorine exemption for drinking water.
You and somebody else.
Could you just maybe confirm that it was the mayor and
Just pick me.
Morning.
Yeah, morning, Helen.
So, my name is Helen Beaumont. For those who haven't met me, I think I've met everybody now. And the residual disinfection report is just an overview of the exemption application process and where we're sitting for the main supply, which is for Christchurch City, and divided into a number of zones, and then for the supplies across Banks Peninsula. It's timely, of course, because there's an article in the newspaper this morning saying that Taumata ROI has declined the first application. We haven't seen the details of that, so we can't comment on what the implications of that are for our supplies. However, we will obtain that. So Taumata ROI, of course, is the new drinking water regulator. They put out the new rules back in July and the new standards. All of our drinking water safety plans were updated to meet those by November the 15th this year. And we're now going through a process of applying for exemptions. So 2 applications are in, one for the Brooklands Kaianga zone here in Christchurch, and one for technical exemptions from a number of monitoring and reporting requirements that we can't yet meet just because of the technology that we have in place. So those technical exemptions are not about the safety of the water as such, but about the reporting systems on the water quality and the controls that are in place. So I'm happy to answer any questions on this.
Aaron, and then Mark, and then Jan.
Yeah. So thank you for that, Helen. Of all the councils across New Zealand that have done all this work and been scrambling around to meet all of the new standards, how many have been granted exemptions so far?
That's the first decision that I'm aware of. So
None.
the applications have been going in the latter half of this year, once the guidelines were released, and that's the first decision that I'm aware of.
And that
There
was
may
it.
have been others, but not that I'm aware of.
Right, so we haven't heard of anyone actually getting one yet.
No, we haven't.
Cool.
Mark, yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Helen, for your report and for the timetabling there. Am I reading it correctly that in West Christchurch we're looking at 3 years before any applications are likely to be made? Is that
That's
right?
correct.
It seems extraordinary that the Taumata ROI is making it so difficult for us all to get rid of this pesky chlorine that we've been...
We don't actually know yet. So until we get feedback on our first application, we don't actually know how challenging it will be. But it is fair to say that, given that in the legislation there is a requirement for residual disinfection unless an exemption is obtained, that they do mean it to be a high bar to get that exemption.
Thank you.
Pauline?
Helen, do you know when we'll hear back on the detail of why it was declined?
The one for Selwyn,
No, you said what our one was declined. Our
no,
application.
only one has. There's only one decision been issued, and that was in the newspaper today,
Oh,
and that
so-
was for Rakaya Huts, which is Selwyn
Okay.
District Council supply.
Right, so you haven't heard back on ours yet,
No.
the Brooklands Kaianga one.
But I understand, Helen, that they've got a list of things that if they fix those, I'm under the impression that if they're fixed, they could be right, but they don't know yet, do they?
I can only go by what is reported in the newspaper,
Fine.
and that's no disrespect to any journalists that are present.
Feel free.
Doesn't always tell the whole story, so I'd prefer not to comment until I see the report.
Welcome, Stephen. Oh, sorry, Yana, you had a question?
So, by the time the exemption process for most of these comes into effect, or we apply for them, we won't be doing water anymore.
That's
So
correct.
what's the I mean, I'm just trying to get my head around, in terms of the new water entities, like, what ability do we have to get them, require them to seek exemptions?
Well, that will be through the various levels of governance in the new water services entity, but the approach we're taking within Three Waters and as a council is that we're continuing to operate and plan for our Three Waters network services as though we're going to continue to supply them. And indeed, for most of my group, they will, but it will be under a new entity and under new governance. However, the planning remains much the same in terms of managing the risk and delivering the services to the community. So we will continue to plan as though we are still going to continue to deliver these services. And indeed, after the general election, there may be some changes. So we need to plan for all scenarios.
Right. And in terms of the water zones, like we were looking at smaller water zones, is any of that work able to be done so that we can seek exemptions quicker? Like, I'm just mindful of central Christchurch, which has a huge catchment. But if we were to rezone into some smaller zones, maybe those zones could seek an exemption earlier instead of waiting for 5 years.
So we are continuing the work on the water rezoning, and we're just modifying the modelling for that to take into account the new land use zoning and the proposed growth areas across the city. And yes, that will give us better control of those smaller zones, and we may be able to advance that timetable. The central zone, the big challenge, of course, is the reservoirs. So yes, breaking that zone up will help.
Right. And just the final question is, could we bring forward any funding to help get these exemptions sooner, particularly for the central zone? Like, how can we, if we wanted to make resources available to get the exemption applied for quicker than 5 years, how could we do that?
Well, that would be a long-term plan conversation. However, the real challenge with the water supply is getting those reservoirs offline, and we can only do that in the winter, and we can only do a certain number each winter. Otherwise, the supply is at risk. So it's hard to go too much faster, even if you had unlimited budget to do so.
Pauline? Oh, sorry, Aaron?
So, Helen, even though no one's got sick from our water before, and we're fixing all these problems and jumping to these new standards, do we know that they are going to allow the takeout of chlorine? Because if their plan says there must be residual disinfectant, because you could get a breach at your gate coming up to your house, so without residual disinfectant you could get sick.
No, they only look at to the point of supply. So on the customer side, if you have an issue on your side, that is not taken into consideration. So
Okay.
it's about our side of the network. However, to answer your first question, do I know? No, I don't. So until we get a response back on the Brooklands Kaienga application, we won't know what our chances are of getting an exemption.
So just because the public are listening, with the Brooklands one, every single box that we could possibly tick has been ticked. So if you were to get an exemption, it would be that one. Is that what we're saying?
We believe so.
Okay.
However, it's like going through an audit for the first time. Until you know what the auditors are looking for, you don't really know what information, what documentation, what controls are important to them.
But
So that's what we're doing. We're going through for the first time,
But
and we
you-
expect them to come back to us and ask for further information, and we expect then to have a conversation about that further information.
But you work with some of the best water engineers in the country. You and your team would have gone, we can't make this any better. This is as good as it gets. So if we're going to get an exemption, this would be it?
We do think the Brooklands Kaienga is our best chance, yes.
Cool. So once we get that, that'll really set the playing field to, yes, there's a possibility, or maybe we shouldn't be spending as much money because there is no chance anyone's ever getting an exemption.
We'll wait and see what we get back, yes.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Just one question from me, Helen, and it sort of follows along from what Yanni was saying, which I thought was a good question. Are we in a little bit of, I won't say fool's paradise, not the word to use, of doing our, putting our exemptions in, asking for exemptions, when it all changes in 2024, they could just flatly say, no exemptions, this is what we're doing. Are we run the risk of that at all?
No, the Taumata Arawai are separate to the new water services entity. So the legislation for Taumata Arawai is already in place. The requirements for exemptions are already in place, and the new rules and standards are already in place. So we know what we're dealing with on the compliance side. The water services entities, in terms of the decision making, is another thing. So that is much less clear, and there's a lot more work to be done over the next 18 months. In terms of the transition and how each council will interact with the new water services entities.
Okay, thank you for that. Timothy?
With the hugely expensive layer cake of bureaucracy which Three Waters has created or is going to create, would we be able to work out exactly who makes the decision for exemptions? Because you're saying that somewhere in that layer cake is the decision level.
There's two levels of decision. One is whether or not you wish to apply for an exemption, and that is the supplier, so in this case the council, and in the future the new water services entity, and then who approves an exemption or not, and that is Taumata Arawai.
So the new water entity has nothing to do with that then?
Taumata Arawai is the regulator,
okay.
So they make the decision, that's correct.
So I thought you mentioned before that we didn't quite know who was going to make, once Three Waters is up and running, that we didn't know who would be making that decision, but it is the new Te Ara.
That's the first decision, as to how you wish to operate your water supply, so and whether or not you wish to apply for an exemption.
Well, we've already kind of had that discussion, so we do want to, don't we?
That's correct.
Yep, so... Yeah, but I'm just kind of getting confused listening, because is it going to be worth it? Because you're saying we don't know whether we're going to get, but if Te Arawai are the final decision makers, we should actually be concentrating on them, shouldn't we, with regards to... So where does Three Waters kind of govern that? Doesn't at all?
Not at present, no. I was just answering the question from Councillor Johansson when I referred to the new water services entities.
Okay.
Sorry, Helen, if I may, in terms of asking when the entities are up and running, how does a council like us get a voice in to influence them to continue to apply for exemptions for chlorine?
That is still unclear.
Thank you.
And emerging, if you like.
No, that's cool. Any more questions? Melanie has very nicely moved it. And sorry, Yanni, you've got a question.
Well, just quickly, based on that kind of point, like, is there a way that we can apply for the exemptions before we go to the new water entity, so we've got them in the system?
Again, I wouldn't want to apply for any more exemptions until we have the response on the Kāinga Brooklands, and so we know really where we stand and what is important to Taumata Arawai and where they see the strengths and weaknesses, if you like, of the water safety plan that we have in place.
Right. So we could, but I mean, obviously we've got...
Once we have that back,
that
we
decision
will
back.
have a look at that timetable, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Helen. So we've now got a mover and seconder in Tyrone. So any discussion, any debate? Yes, Tyrone? Yes.
I just want to thank you for the report and just thank Helen and others, and Jane and Tim Drennan and many others who have really gone to the next level to do exceptional work in Birdlings Flat in particular. So just to thank you from me.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks Helen also for clarifying those bits during the questions, and I think the public of Christchurch can have a lot of confidence in the way you're doing this, because if we're going to get an exemption, it will be the one you've got in, and then that will give us a clear direction going forward on whether we can get others. So I think you've clarified that today. That's really helpful, and I think people can have confidence over the summer that we kind of might know where we're going, on the other side of Christmas, and hopefully we will. So thank you for that, and you've made that really clear, so that's great.
I want to acknowledge the work that staff have have done. I think what this does is paint a really bleak picture of the government's reforms in this space and the complexity and the challenges. For the new councillors may not recall, but when we had a meeting up on the 6th floor with the Department of Internal Affairs, when they first announced they were looking at the water issue, we asked a very simple question: can you please just clarify what the exemption process is to get the temporary chlorine removed out of our water as soon as possible? And that was probably about 4, maybe 5 years ago, and we still have no clear understanding, and we're waiting on decisions from a new regulator. But in the meantime, we've had to spend a huge amount of resource and money addressing a risk which is pretty small. And history post-earthquake would show that actually we do manage our water supply pretty good in this city. We have exceptional staff that generally are really good at keeping an eye on it, because we value the fact that we don't have treated water, and we want that to continue. So, this is really frustrating, but I do appreciate the really clear information in a very complex environment that staff are presenting today. It's just incredibly disappointing that we're still waiting to get the exemptions to remove the temporary chlorination from our water supply, or the residual disinfectant for the permanent. And I just think it's inherently unfair for government to have put this burden on our city with all the other pressures that we've been under post-earthquake. But I think obviously it'll be up to the new entity. There's already been signals that there'll be possibly significant price increases in terms of charging for water. I hope that the work that we can do in the meantime will get us in a good position that when we apply for the exemption, it can be granted, because people want the chlorine out of the water as soon as possible, and we need to be really focused on that.
Thank you, Yanni. And it's not so much also the burden on the city, it's also the burden on staff who've been, I remember last Christmas, they all worked through Christmas time to get a result for the government, and it didn't get listened to. So anyway, moving right along, I'd like to put the motion. All those in favour? Those against? Thank you, carried.